Hello, and welcome to the Black Ponderer. I'm Neil Trotter. Today, we return to René Descartes. This time, we're talking about his work called The World, or A Treatise on Light and the Other Principal Objects of the Senses. And I'm reading this that is saying that he wrote this work in 1633, but it was published in 1664. This is actually the same book that we used last time. This book is a Penguin Classics, and it's called Discourse on Method and Other Related Writings. So it also includes the work and also another one of his works, as well as some letters he wrote and to respond to some critics. It's a nice little collection, but we'll get to those, all that other stuff in later videos. Today we're talking about the world. The world is basically about the limitations on perception and what we can do to overcome those limitations. Let me explain. Humans in particularly, we have this ego problem oftentimes. So we think that what we perceive is really what is ultimately the reality. Like that's the reality. What we see with our eyes, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch, all the senses, that's the reality. You know, and if it's not, it doesn't fall within that realm, then it's not the reality. And you know, we're kind of cocky like that. But that's actually not the case at all. Really what we perceive with our senses is not really what reality is. Take for example this book, this object, right? It's hard, solid, has pages, ink on the page, all that stuff. Is a front cover, back cover. You know, we have this perception of what a book really is. But in reality, a book really isn't all those things. I mean, it is all those things, but really what this book really is a group or a collection or a clump of atoms, and then further there's these subatomic particles that make up these atoms. And one thing you have to realize is that we know now is that an atom is just a nucleus and electrons around that nucleus. The interesting part about that is that between the nucleus and the electrons, there's a huge amount of space in between. And because everything is made up of that atoms, really, most solid objects are mostly space. In fact, everything around us, like everything, all the matter pretty much is just, most of it is just empty space. You know, you knock on it and you think, oh, this is a solid object, but not really. It really is just it's just empty space. So, and with science, we're now finally starting to figure out why actually solid objects are solid. And it has to do with the work that's being done in a Large Hadron Collider up in Switzerland, around that area. And we're using science to rise above our perception of things. And we're starting to really begin to understand the actual reality of the world. Now, you might think, oh, that, you know, I'm sorry to get off topic, but not really. Like, that's really what we're getting at with the world. Is like we're trying to. René Descartes is saying, like, look, what your perception of things is not exactly how the world is, but to bridge that gap between perception and reality, you use science. Really, that's what the world's about. Let's dive into some quotes and get into some more meaning on that theme. Oftentimes, on page 1, right off the bat, there's a powerful quote. They're trying to hook you in. You know, this one is no exception. You know, it's a common method to hook you in. There's this quote, page 1, and it jumped at me. Let me share it with you. Thus, it can happen that we hear a speech and understand its meaning very well, but we are unable later to say what language was used in making the speech. Now, if words, which have meaning only as a result of a human convention, are enough to make us think about things that do not resemble them in any way, why is it not possible that nature may also have established a particular sign which would make us have the sensation of light, even though such a sign contains nothing in itself that resembles the sensation? You know, idioms are just sayings that really by themselves don't mean anything, but we attach meaning to them, right? I mean, that's just an example of what he's talking about when he's talking about language and the perception of language. For example, so a saying like, stop beating around the bush, right? That's this quote that we use, which means like stop dilly-dallying and let's get to the point. You know, let's solve the issue at hand. Stop worrying about all this other stuff. And as an American English speaker, we understand this, but if you're not familiar with American English, you're not really gonna get that. And it kind of has on its own, it has no meaning. The phrase comes from something. I don't know where it comes from, but it did have some type of meaning attached to it in the past. But nowadays, people just use that quote, and they use all types of other quotes or idioms that by themselves don't mean anything. And what Descartes is saying, like, okay, if that's what we do with language, it's probably the same case that we also do it with nature. And it's true. We do that with nature. And he's specifically talking about light here, the sensation of light. And that's definitely true. It took us a while to figure out the full spectrum of light. For example, we now know that heat is light. That took us a while to discover that, because our perception of heat is different from our perception of light. Right? But it is the case. It's infrared light. And then there's all different types of light that we use. Oftentimes we see it in those beautiful images of galaxies that you can just like type in on Google, like Hubble Space Telescope pictures. And really those pictures aren't really what a galaxy actually looks like with our eyes. It's more using various different kinds of light and putting them into and coloring them in a way that we can see the detail in our eyes. But we use all different spectrums of light to observe the universe, because a lot of what we see in the universe we can't really see with our eyes. And this is what he's talking about, Descartes. Our perception limits us to see the true nature of things. Let's continue. In this way we can free ourselves from a mistake with which we have all been prejudiced since our infancy, when we believe that there were no bodies surrounding us apart from those that could be sensed, and therefore if the air were a body, since we perceive it very slightly, at least it ought not to be as material or as solid as those that we sense more. And he's just talking about, he's using air as an example. Like, back in those days, they thought that air wasn't actually matter. It was, I don't know what they thought it was. But it took them some time to figure that out, that air is actually gas molecules up in the air, and that air is matter just like the rock is matter. It's just in different densities. And what Descartes is getting at is this whole universal understanding of the world or the universe, not separating the universe into different things based off of our perceptions. Like, no, there's a universality in the world, and we can use science to determine that, separate from our perception. I believe that there is an infinity of different motions in the world which last forever, after having noticed the greatest among them, which cause the days, months, and years. I take note that the vapors of the earth never cease to ascend to the clouds and descend again, that the air is constantly moved by winds, that the sea is never at rest, that fountains and rivers flow incessantly, that the most stable buildings eventually fall into decay, that animals and plants are either growing or decaying. In brief, that there is nothing anywhere which does not change. From this I know clearly that it is not only in a flame that there are many small parts which do not cease to move, but that the same motion occurs in all other bodies, even if their actions are not as forceful, and even if, because of their small size, they cannot be perceived by any of our senses. And again, he's talking about this universal application of how to understand the world. Really, when you think about it, he's getting at quantum mechanics. Although at the time, quantum mechanics wasn't understood, or it wasn't even known. He's really getting at this idea that everything is in motion, and it is true. Atoms are always constantly in motion, and it depends on how densely collected they are, or as atoms are constantly training electrons with each other all the time. So he's getting at that, and Descartes was onto something. He knew something was going on. He's also talking about things like chemistry, right? Because chemistry, really, when you think about it, is the study of change and how everything is constantly changing. Back then, back in the 1600s, chemistry was really in its infancy, and for the most part it was called alchemy, And really smart individuals were trying to find things like turning lead into gold in the search for the philosopher's stone, or what a lot of other people call the sorcerer's stone. Those were real pursuits back then. I mean, even Isaac Newton was looking for those kinds of things when he was during his spare time. But you have to start from somewhere, right? They didn't know. They're working with the limited amount of information, and they're using science to verify their observations or their speculations. And they're trying to rise above their perceptions. And you gotta tip your hat off to those people that are doing that. And let's continue even more. This is very interesting because Descartes is trying to understand the different states of matter. He's trying to theorize. He's speculating that there are various states of matter, but all things are matter. There's just various states. This is what he says. I conceive of the first one, which could be called the element of fire, as the most subtle and penetrating liquid in the world. As regards the second element, which would be understood as the element of air, besides these two elements, I accept no other apart from a third, namely the element of earth. I judge that its parts are bigger and move more slowly in comparison with parts. For that which I attributed to the first element consists in the fact that its parts move so extremely quickly and are so small that no other body is able to stop them, and in addition, they do not require any determinate size, shape, or position. The form of the second element consists in the fact that its parts have a motion and size that are so moderate that if there are many causes in the world which can increase their motion and decrease their size, there must be as many others which can do the exact opposite. Thus they remain permanently balanced in this same moderate condition. The form of the third element consists in the fact that its parts are so large and so joined together that they always have the force to resist the motion of other bodies. Descartes is really getting at what we now know as very different states of matter. Now we know the various states of matter as a solid, a liquid, and a gas. And then there's a fourth in between state of matter, plasma, right? But Descartes, he didn't know. I mean, he's working off what he has, and he's speculating. And this is pretty good for back in the 1600s when you didn't have a lot of information. I mean, he's saying that there are three separate elements. He calls one fire, he calls the other one air, and he's calling the other one earth. It's pretty close, but more importantly, what he's talking about is the motion of the particles that they're composed of. For a motion like fire, is what he's saying is that the particles are moving so rapidly, that's why the state is how it is. And it's the same thing when we think about the state of gas. Really, atoms are moving so fast that they're in this state of gas. And the slower they move, the more solid they become. He's also talking about the size of the various particles. That's kind of off, but it's not off, because there's heavier elements on the periodic table, and then there's lighter elements on the periodic table. So he's really getting at this truth, and really what it is he's using his observation to try and rise above his perception. He's saying, like, these things are so small we can't see them. They're moving at such fast paces we can't really see the individual motion of each particle, but we do notice them as various states of the same matter. And that's key. That's key. Let's continue. For God has established these laws so wondrously that even if we were to imagine that he created nothing more than what we have mentioned so far, and even if he imposed on it no order or proportion, but made it like the most confused and disordered chaos that poets could describe, the laws are enough to cause the parts of this chaos to disentangle from each other and become arranged in such a good order that they would have the form of a very perfect world, in which one could see not only some light, but also all the other things, but general and particular, that appear in the real world. Now he's talking about this general or universal law of the universe, or the world. He's saying, like, there is some sort of universal law that exists, that applies to everything. And it might be beyond our perception, but it exists. And so he's a religious person. He's saying it's probably the case that God made up these laws from the beginning, and they are what dictate what's going on in the universe. There's some interesting points here that you could talk about. The first point, which I just talked about, is these universal laws, like gravity, for instance. The universe, when it first started, it was very chaotic, and then gravity took over and joined all this matter together and formed stars, planets, galaxies, and the works, right? You have this other law, the quantum mechanics, that deals with the very particularly small, right? And in reality, when you did this, quantum mechanics and the laws of motion, gravity, and they could be unified into one particular law, but that law is, at this very moment, is beyond our perception, right? We don't understand how to connect the two, but in reality, it is probably the case that these laws are one and the same. There's some way to connect them, and currently, right now, there are efforts by scientists trying to unify these laws. One of them is string theory, right? Descartes saying like there's some things that are beyond our perception, like these laws, and we can use science to try and describe them and understand them, and we can use the understanding of these laws to understand how the world works. And the other point I see from this is, he's talking about, he references God here, and a lot of people think like, well, if you believe in evolution, you can't be a religious person, or if you believe in the Big Bang Theory, then there's no way you can believe in God or anything else. That's not true. A lot of these, for example, a lot of these great philosophers are Christians themselves. It could be the case that you could be a Christian and believe like, hey, God created this reality that we know as evolution. Life evolves from very simple forms into very complex forms like humans, and God set that up from the beginning. I mean, you could take it that way. Same thing with like the Big Bang. Maybe the minute God said, let there be light, that was the instant of the Big Bang, and he set up all these rules. What he really did was set up these laws of motion, like gravity, and he set up these laws that we know as quantum mechanics, and then he just let the laws do the work for him. I mean, he could have worked smart and not hard. So the other point is that just because you're a religious person doesn't necessarily mean that you're not a scientific person as well. There's also like many scientists who are also Christians as well. I mean, that's definitely possible. A lot of people think like that's just not the case, but it is the case. But ultimately what the world is about understanding that there's limitations to our perception. And then you gotta think about it. That's a lot of times when people take advantage of our limitations of perception. Magicians do it, right? They know how we perceive things are not actually how they actually are, and they take advantage of this, and they do all these, they wow us with all these magic tricks. Some people believe in magic and all that, but I think it's more so that these magicians, entertainers, they embrace the fact that there's limitations to the perception of humans, and they use that to their advantage to create these magic tricks that are actually reality, that can be explained scientifically, and it wows us. Same thing with a lot of, when people, when they see UFOs or when they look at paranormal activity, there's a lot of things that, I'm not going to be a hater and say like all these people are lying or they're confused. I'm not going to hate on those people. But I will say, I mean, maybe we could agree that most of those claims are basically just misunderstanding on perception. You see something and you think, oh, it has to be real. I saw it with my own eyes. It has to be the case. I've heard it, I felt it, but you really have to take a step back and be like, okay, I did see something. Is it really this crazy thing that I'm thinking, or can it be explained on a scientific level? Because oftentimes it can. And that's the problem. Sometimes we assume that our perception is pitch perfect, and then we start getting in this realm of false reality, and we start making conclusions that aren't real, and then it holds us back, and we start going on these pursuits that really have no conclusions or no definitive answers, and we're kind of just wasting time because we're going off of these perceptions that aren't really based on any reality. And that's really the point at what Descartes is trying to get at. He's like, listen, let's use science to understand the actual reality of the world, because we can't understand the reality of the world simply based off our perception, because our perceptions are limited. Our senses, the five senses: sight, touch, taste, hearing, and smell, right? Those five senses. If you want to be paranormal about it, the sixth sense, they're limited. They're not pitch perfect. They have evolved over time and developed into some marvelous things. Now, it is marvelous and spectacular that people are able to sense the world in these various ways, but they're not pitch perfect. You know, just accept that and be like, okay, you know, the reality of the situation is that I'm not going to completely be able to understand the world based solely on my perception. So the things that are beyond my perception, I'm going to have to use some science to really understand the reality. And even that's limited to a certain extent, because the human brain can only understand so much, right? So we could try our best, but it also can be the case that reality itself is beyond our understanding. And that's something that we need to accept. But we can try to understand as best as we can and realize our limitations. Well, that's what Descartes is getting at. It's also very important to note that, like I said before, he wrote this work in 1633, but it did not get published until 1664. And that's because he didn't want to deal with what was going on with the ruling body at the time, which was the church. They were, you know, cracking down hard on people who threw out these kinds of ideas, because people started thinking about this, and then they were like, well, the church doesn't really know everything. There's a lot of things I can know on my own. And you know, a lot of people take that as an argument against religion, but I see it more as an argument against the ruling power. And it's like the church at the time was the ruling body, and anything that conflicted with that or compromised that ruling body or tried to test it, they brought it down. So a lot of these scientific papers, the church was like, no, we're not having that, because people start asking questions and they'll start questioning things, and they won't turn to us for everything. So no, we're not having that. So even then they wanted to crack down on this idea that perception is limited, and you know, even something like the church might not be able to understand everything. And the church was like, no. So, you know, it's important to understand these things. But again, what was going on was that it was too bad, because they were creating a cage of understanding, a prison, you know, a thought prison. People weren't able to really work toward understanding the reality or the truth of how the world actually works. People's understandings were limited. There was a ruling body that didn't want to go so far as to say our perception is limited, because it compromises their power structure. And that's sad. But Descartes is cool here, because he's like one of the first people to write that down on paper and be like, hey, you realize that your perception is limited, and there's a way that we can rise above that, and that's through science. I encourage you to read The World. It's not that long. The information isn't outdated. I mean, his conclusions, you know, when he's talking about elements and things like that, they're outdated, but the points that he's making aren't outdated. In fact, they're very relevant today. So I invite you to read it. It's a great read, and it's a great philosophical work. Well, this is The Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. Thanks for watching.